I'd like to introduce Beth Zork, Senior Vice President for Wells Fargo, and she'll introduce the presentation.
Hi, good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event. Sandra Day O'Connor is well known for being the first in so many ways. The first female majority leader of the Arizona State Senate, and of course, the first female to serve on the Supreme Court. I imagine that most of you know that earlier today, Nina Totenberg was interviewing Justice Ginsburg. And during that interview, for those of you who were lucky enough to be there in person, there was a discussion of another important first, the first job. Justice Ginsburg, in fact, referenced the book that you all are here to hear about tonight. And she said that what is so critical is that first job. And she described Sandra Day O'Connor's rejection from the top law firms, despite being first in her class at Stanford. Justice Ginsburg and Justice O'Connor have both inspired generations of female lawyers, including myself, to go to law school and to pursue every type of legal career in the government, including the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, or perhaps at a large law firm, and certainly not as a legal secretary, the only job that was afforded to Sandra Day O'Connor when she applied to a law firm. To me, though, first is ultimately a story about putting the family first. And the challenges faced by Sandra Day O'Connor are certainly ones that resonate with working parents today. I have to admit, I couldn't help but smile when reading how Justice O'Connor managed to efficiently and effectively end the final session of the Arizona State Senate by telling the other senators that she wasn't going to stay all night and watch the men play cards, but that she was going to make sure that she was home and that her boys had their bags packed for camp the next day. Discussing the struggle and impact of great leaders like Justice O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg is one of the reasons why the National Book Festival is so important. And it's one of the many reasons why Wells Fargo has been proud to be a charter sponsor for the last 9 years. Wells Fargo is committed to advancing literacy and reading, and last year our team members read to 106,000 children and donated more than 58,000 books through our Reading First program. You may have seen our booth downstairs where kids are making bookmarks and lassoing ponies and riding the ponies. So now to this evening's program. Tonight we have the good fortune to learn more about Justice O'Connor from acclaimed journalist author Evan Thomas. And it's my pleasure to bring to the microphone John Haskell, who is from the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress, to introduce tonight's speaker, author of First, Evan Thomas. Thank you. I'm so sorry.
I was just talking to the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, in the green room, and she wanted me to remind you all that it's officially and indisputably a fact that this is the best free event in Washington, D.C. And actually, these presentations are better than a lot of events that you have to pay for. The Kluge Center is one of the sponsors of the National Book Festival, together with Wells Fargo, the Washington Post, National Endowment for the Arts, et cetera. And we're proud to sponsor 3 of the events on the history stage, including this one. The Kluge Center's mission at the library is to bridge the gap between scholarship and the policy-making community and the interested public by bringing leading thinkers in the humanities and social sciences to the Library of Congress for periods in residence to do research in the library collections, and by showcasing the work of those scholars and other prominent writers in public events and in other forums. We have several public events this fall on topics as diverse as 100 years of women voting, the presidential primaries, complicity in the Great Recession. I hope you'll Google us at the Kluge Center, K-L-U-G-E, and look into attending. Today, the library is honored to have Evan Thomas to discuss his book on Sandra Day O'Connor. Thomas is the author of 10 books, including the New York Times best-selling John Paul Jones, also Sea of Thunder, and Being Nixon. He was a writer, correspondent, and editor for 33 years at Time and Newsweek, including 10 years as Newsweek's Washington bureau chief. He's appeared on TV and radio and many different shows, including Meet the Press and Morning Joe, and he has taught writing and journalism at Harvard and Princeton, where he was the Ferris Professor of Journalism from 2007 to 2014. Thomas will be in conversation with Colleen Shogan, who's the Assistant Deputy Librarian for Collections and Services at the library. Colleen is also the Vice Chair of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. Please join me in welcoming Evan and Colleen.
Thanks, John. As he mentioned, you've written a number of books on diverse subjects, the CIA, Richard Nixon, Robert Kennedy. Why turn to Sandra Day O'Connor?
She came to me, and I was thrilled. It took me 1 second to say yes. She had thought about writing her own memoirs, but a couple of things happened along the way. One is that, as you know, as many of you know, she has dementia now. And she was in the very early stages of it then. But also, I think that she was somebody who wanted to have her story told, but there's a part of her that's very private and didn't really want to tell her own story, wanted to have somebody else do it. So I was brought in, and the wonderful thing is that she gave all her papers to the Library of Congress and gave me access to them. And they included things like her husband's daily diary of her period in the Supreme Court, and letters and pretty much everything else as well. You really cannot do a biography of a Supreme Court justice unless you have that kind of access, because although they publish their opinions in ways it's an open process, it's secret. And I was given this window in this secret world that was just fascinating.
The book begins and really ends with the Lazy Bee Ranch, the rural ranch where Sandra Day O'Connor grew up. Can you describe the ranch and also talk about why it was so influential in her life?
The Lazy Bee Ranch is in the southeast corner of Arizona, and it is beautiful and forlorn and dry. Doesn't rain there, and they had 160,000 acres. It took a man on horseback a full day to ride from one end to the other. She called it, she said it was like it was our own country. The king of this country was her father, Mr. Day, and he was a pretty autocratic king, a formidable guy, and she liked to tell this story to her clerks that when she was about 15, one of her jobs was to bring lunch out to the Roundup. Now, the Roundup was way the hell out there on the prairie, and she got up at 5 a.m. and she cooked the roast and cooked the cake and got in the car, and on the way out, she had a flat tire. And so she got out. She's a slight girl then, and she had to jump on the jack to change the tire. She was an hour late getting to the Roundup, and her father looked at her and said, "You're late." And she said, "Well, Dad, I had to change a flat tire." And he said, "Next time, leave earlier." And that was the story she told her clerks, no excuses. She lived a life of no excuses. And now that's half the story. She did learn self-reliance in a big way on this ranch. I mean, her playmates were cowboys. But there's another piece of it that's important. Her mother, I think in a way, was more influential, in a more subtle way. Her mother was a very elegant woman who lived on this dusty ranch but always wore a dress, always wore hose, subscribed to Vogue, was very fashionable. And Sandra watched her mother and father together. And at night, Mr. Day could be a bully. He could have a couple of drinks. And Sandra watched them together. And her mom was not submissive, didn't roll over, but did not pick fights either. Knew when to walk away, knew when to not take the bait. That was a very important thing for Sandra Day O'Connor, to learn how to deal with obnoxious males. She dealt with a lot of obnoxious males over the year, and she learned how watching her mother and her father.
When she's a junior at Stanford, she decides that she wants to go to law school. Why did she decide to pursue law when at that point in American history it was such a male-dominated profession?
You know, she didn't even know if she wanted to be a lawyer. She liked to learn. Her favorite course at Stanford was Western Civilization, Western Civ, And of course, I'm sorry to say they don't teach anymore because it's considered to be too hegemonic and patriarchal and all that. But in her day, it gave her a fascination with the rule of law. I have in her papers at the Library of Congress is her final exam in Western Civ. And it's a brilliant, she's 17 years old. She went to college when she was 16. It's a brilliant treatise on Jefferson and Madison and the rule of law. So she had this innate fascination. Now, she didn't know if she wanted to be a lawyer because, as you say, there are really very few women lawyers, but she wanted to keep learning.
When she's at law school, she met William Rehnquist. This is one of the big surprises in the book. Can you talk about the nature of their relationship and how it changed over time?
Well, this is a surprise to us, too, because going through letters at the Library of Congress, we noticed there weren't any love letters. My wife, O.C., who worked with me on this book and was deeply involved in this book, and I, where are the love letters? Because I knew she had a great marriage. So we were over in her chambers in the Supreme Court, and her longtime secretary, she was no longer there, but her secretary took us down to a storeroom in the basement, and there was another box marked correspondence, and we said, what's in there? And we got permission to look in there, and there were the love letters, a lot of love letters between John O'Connor and Sandra, but also 14 love letters from Bill Rehnquist to Sandra O'Connor. Bill Rehnquist was her classmate. They had gone out as first-year students. He'd gone down to the ranch. He had sort of flunked the test down there, and they were not going out anymore. But he went off to be a clerk in the Supreme Court. In the middle of his third year, he went actually to be a Supreme Court clerk. And he was lonely in Washington, started writing Sandra, remembering how much he loved her. And in letter about number 7, he says to me, will you marry me, Sandy? They had never told anybody. They never told their own families. So this was a complete, I let out a little whoop when I saw this letter. Now, this is a happy story, actually, because she was already in love with John. She did string along Bill Rehnquist for a while, but she married John, and they remained friends, good friends. He, as a matter of fact, secretly lobbied President Reagan to put her on the court in 1980-81. So they had a wonderful friendship, but not a marriage.
So talk a little bit about the man that becomes her husband, John O'Connor. What was he like? That's a big part of the book. What was the nature of their relationship and their marriage?
John O'Connor, while her own dad was very intense, John was cheerful and loose, and he made her laugh. And he was incredibly supportive of her. He was a very strong guy himself. I mean, her grades were better. She was Order of the Coif, top 10%, but he was on law review. He was pretty good. And they went to Phoenix together and had a great marriage, had 3 kids. And he was ambitious for her, and she was ambitious for him. Now, as it happened, she got the big plum. She got the Supreme Court job, and he had to support her, and he did. And how he did that, we should talk more about this a little bit later, but this book is partly a love story.
Why does President Reagan decide to nominate Sandra Day O'Connor for the court? Did he know that he wanted to put a woman on the court? And how does he initially find out about her? Because at that point in time, she's serving in a state court system in Arizona.
Yeah. She was a middle-level judge, a state court of appeals judge. But a couple of things. One is there really weren't that many Republican, I mean, the law is a male-dominated thing in 1980. Out of 600 federal judges, only 8 are women, and most of them are liberal Democrats appointed by President Carter. So it was a small pool. Reagan himself decides to do this initially out of political instincts. It's October 1980, and he is in Illinois, a swing state, behind women by 10 points. And his political aides say, hey, you got to do something here to close the gap. And so he promises that one of his first appointments will be a woman. Now, he wins the election, and at the Justice Department, the Attorney General and his aides don't really believe he's going to appoint a woman. They think he's going to appoint Bob Bork, who is a true believer, a good conservative.
Right.
So they're getting ready to appoint Bob Bork when Justice Potter Stewart signals that he's going to quit. But Reagan says, no, I'm serious. Unless you cannot find a qualified woman, I want a woman. Now, James A. Baker, the president's chief of staff, said you can be sure he talked to Nancy about that. And so they start looking for a woman. And Bill Rehnquist on the Supreme Court is quietly lobbying. And Warren Burger, the Chief Justice, is also lobbying for her. And she becomes really the obvious choice.
And she had met Berger earlier and sort of won him over.
She had charmed him on a houseboat on Lake Powell in 1979. There's a photograph of them on the boat that night. You can tell he's in love.
So when O'Connor arrives to the court, do the other justices welcome her with open arms? Does she find the court an institution that's welcoming to women initially?
Not exactly. Well, interesting, she goes to lunch, and only half the justices are there. Only 4 of them even come to lunch. They were not all that glad to see her. There had never been a woman justice. It's a totally male world. And they talked to Justice Stevens, told Olsey and me when we went to see him, that they said, the job of a junior justice on the Supreme Court is to do a couple things: take notes and get coffee. So they say, well, tradition is tradition, but they never asked her to get coffee.
Right.
But they were a little chilly with her. Justice White, Whizzer White, Byron White, great former all-pro halfback as well as Supreme Court justice. They have a wonderful tradition at the court of shaking hands before going into their conference, their private meeting. And they always shake hands. And so Justice O'Connor, going into her very first conference, shakes Justice White's hand. He crushes it. She goes into with the tears squirting out of her eyes, she said. She's crying when she goes to her first conference. Now, she got over it in a hurry, but it was a cold place. Another little story that was telling of the time: the Chief Justice sends her a memo of a study by a famous psychiatrist. And what happens when a woman comes into a man's world, when a woman joins a group of powerful men? What happens? He said, well, according to the psychiatrist, the men can be disturbed by this, and it can be destabilizing. So what should the woman do? She should be passive. Justice O'Connor took this and just wrote, file it,
Right.
and put it away.
Right. So, of course, we heard from another justice this morning. Ruth Bader Ginsburg made an appearance at the National Book Festival. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between O'Connor and Ginsburg? And both justices were very involved in women in the law. How were their approaches similar? How were they different? And was O'Connor a feminist?
That's a good question. O'Connor never called herself a feminist. She had grown up in this man's world, and she was very careful she was not an avowed activist. Now, actually, she was an activist, but she did it behind the scenes. One telling example about this. You remember the Equal Rights Amendment, which is actually making a little bit of a comeback. It looked like a no-brainer that it would pass the states as a constitutional amendment in the late 60s and 70s. It was almost uncontroversial until Phyllis Schlafly, remember Phyllis Schlafly, came along in the 70s, and she led this campaign against it. That what would happen if the Equal Rights Amendment passed, women would be drafted and women would be a threat to men, and all of a sudden the political tide turned. Well, Justice O'Connor now is in the Arizona legislature. She's the majority leader of the first ever woman to be the head of a state legislature. She introduces the ERA into the legislature, but then she sits on it. It dies in committee. And the activists were really mad at her for kind of selling out. Well, quietly behind the scenes, she's made a couple of decisions. One is, it's not going to pass the Arizona legislature, so I'm not going to waste political capital on that because it doesn't have a chance. Phyllis Schlafly is in the state. Instead, She goes around and changes every single state law that discriminates against women. There were dozens of them. Osi and I found a list that she made that you couldn't get a credit card if you were a woman in Arizona. It was a property state where women had very few legal rights. She changed every single one of them because she could do that. She could, as majority leader, she could do the local change. Never made a big deal out of it. A lot of this was done quietly, but very effective. She did what she could achieve, not what she couldn't achieve.
How did she handle two of the most controversial issues during her time on the court, namely affirmative action and abortion?
Those are also very telling of her. And to take a little bit of time with these because it's important and confusing to people. Let's do abortion first. When she came on the court, she's a Reagan appointee. And Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe v. Wade, the court's famous abortion decision in 1973, thinks that she is going to be a vote to reverse Roe v. Wade. And he is really upset, and he's very cranky with her, very difficult with her. In fact, he's sort of funny. He's also a little difficult with Rehnquist. When I mentioned earlier that Justice Rehnquist and the other justices didn't know that Rehnquist had proposed to her, but they knew they had dated, so that when Justice O'Connor first came on the court, Harry Blackmun turned to Rehnquist and said, "Now, no fooling around." But Blackmun was right that Justice O'Connor had great misgivings about abortion personally. She said she found it repugnant, but she did not vote to reverse. Instead, she becomes the fifth vote to save Roe, to save a woman's right to an abortion. She changes Blackmun's standard, she does, but she says she does give, under her standard, states have the right to impose some restraints on abortion as long as it is not a, quote, undue burden on the right of a woman to have an abortion. Now, what's an undue burden? They're still litigating that. This makes the purists unhappy. It's a compromise. It's a classic O'Connor compromise. She preserves the precedent. She does preserve a woman's right to an abortion, but she gives the states some right to control it. It's a little murky. How much? They've been fighting about it ever since. That's a classic O'Connor down-the-middle compromise. She made the law on abortion famously in the Casey case. That's still the law of the land. As you know, it may change if Ruth Bader Ginsburg doesn't make it and she's replaced it, but for a long time, O'Connor made the law of the land to preserve a woman's right to abortion. On affirmative action, it's a similar story. Justice O'Connor did not like explicit quotas. She voted against affirmative action on a number of cases, on job hiring and federal set-asides, but she is the fifth vote to preserve affirmative action in higher education. Now, why? She was uncomfortable with identity politics. She went to the University of Michigan Law School and saw all these posters of all these groups, and it made her uncomfortable. But she's the fifth vote. Why? Because she's very practical. Justice O'Connor is a very pragmatic person. She's not ideological. She's not associated with any particular doctrine. She's looking at, when she made a decision, she looked at the results on the ground. And she saw, for instance, in California, there was a state referendum that abolishes affirmative action in the state of California. What happened? At UCLA and Berkeley, the percentage of African Americans at the top two law schools goes down to about 1%. She says, that's not acceptable to me. Her view is that law schools are training grounds for leaders. And in fact, I think 1 out of 4 U.S. senators is a lawyer. And so she said, we got to have, at the top of law schools, I want to see African Americans in there. She also was very affected by a brief by the military, by former chiefs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who argued, look, in the military we do affirmative action and it works. That influenced her. And that's why she voted to preserve affirmative action over the squawks and squeals of a lot of conservatives who thought that she had sold them out.
As you mentioned, you describe her jurisprudence as pragmatic. You also say that she's a judicial minimalist. Yeah. How do you answer critics that she was unprincipled?
Well, the argument is that she doesn't stand for any particular doctrine. And you know, that argument has some merit, but I think she was a principled pragmatist. If you follow it all the way through, and I have, you can find certain things that she is focused on. And she was always sensitive to finding a middle ground on big social issues. Why? Because her view of the Supreme Court was not that it's the last word. I mean, when we think of it's the final court of appeal, that's not the way she looked at it. She saw the Supreme Court as in a constant dialogue with the other branches of government, with the executive branch, with Congress, particularly on these difficult big issues, to slowly move the law along, but never get too far out of step with public opinion. She didn't sit around reading the polls, but she knew on abortion, for instance, that about a third of the country is against abortion no matter what, and about a third is for abortion no matter what, and about a third is, well, I'm for abortion under some circumstances. She's in the middle third, because she thought that's where, she read the newspapers, that's where the country was, and she thought that these things ought to be worked out very slowly. They called her a minimalist because she liked narrow decisions that didn't go too far. She didn't quote Learned Hand, but I always think of this great Learned Hand quote. Learned Hand was a famous federal judge who said, "The spirit of liberty is a spirit that's not too sure it's right." And that's the way she was. She was a minimalist. Let's not rush into this. Let's do it slowly. Let's be sensitive. Let's be careful about precedent. But let's be responsive to the felt necessities of the time, as Justice Holmes said, to the felt necessities of the time.
As a justice, did she become more liberal over time? And if so, why?
Well, we asked this question, Elsie and I asked this question of Justice Stevens. We said, do you think that Justice O'Connor moved to the left? And he said, yes. And we said, really? Why? And his two-word answer was, Justice Scalia. Now, he was kidding, but only partly. That's an interesting story because Justice O'Connor welcomed Justice Scalia to the court when he came on in 1986 because he was vibrant and lively, and the court was kind of a sleepy, it was getting old, and the justices weren't coming to lunch, and it was kind of a sleepy place. And she knew it would give it, that Justice Scalia would give it a shot of vigor and intellectual heft. But Justice Scalia was one of those people who suffers from smartest kid in the room syndrome. He just cannot, and the room in this case is the conference room of the US Supreme Court. And he just couldn't help himself. He would send out these ninograms instructing other justices on on their grammar and what to think. This offended Justice O'Connor, who really believed in getting along and not being preached to. And also, Justice Scalia was right rude to her on abortion in particular when Justice O'Connor did not go along with getting rid of Roe v. Wade. In the Webster case, Justice Scalia wrote an opinion in which he said that Justice O'Connor's opinion cannot be taken seriously. That's a harsh thing for a Supreme Court justice to write. Now, with her clerks and in public, Justice O'Connor didn't show any resentment. In fact, when her clerks tried to write little nasty responses into her opinion, she'd take them out. But she noticed it. We have a friend who played tennis doubles with her, and John O'Connor, Sandra O'Connor's husband, set up a doubles game with Scalia because he could see there was a little bad blood there. And O'Connor spent the entire game trying to drill Justice Scalia in net, and she was a better player than he was. When it was over, Justice Scalia said to our friend, Dr. Leahy, "We're never doing that again."
Yeah. Why did she side with a majority in Bush v. Gore?
This is by far her most controversial case, and in her own mind, a controversial case. And I'm going to take a little time with this to give you the background, because this is still a sensitive subject. You all remember the case. 2000, the vote's basically a tie. Bush is ahead by 500 votes in Florida. Remember the hanging chads? So there's a recount. And the recount goes on, but the Republican Secretary of State, Kathleen Harris, certifies a Bush victory The Gore campaign objects, wants the recount to go on, and it goes to the Supreme Court. By a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court stops the recount, effectively electing George Bush. Now, the problem is the 5 are all conservative Republicans, and the 4 who want it to go on are Democrats or liberals. It looks like a purely political thing. The Supreme Court likes to say we're not political. 5-4, conservatives on one side, liberals on the other. Looks really bad. Sandra O'Connor's in the 5. And so she took a lot of heat for this. And she's a political person. She's a Republican. She had been a Republican in the Arizona legislature. Why did she vote this way? Because she is practical and she can look down the road. And Justice Ginsburg actually first told us about this. Under the law, there is a law on this. What happens if there are 2 sets of electors? Now, assume the Supreme Court had said the recount can go on, which is what the Gore folks wanted. You could have had, and assume that Gore won the recount. Now there would be 2 sets of electors. The electors certified by the Republican Secretary of State and a Democratic group. There's a law for this, 3 U.S.C. 15, that says when there are 2 sets of electors, it goes to Congress. The House has a vote, 1 vote, and the Senate has 1 vote. Now, the House was going to be Republican, and the Senate was going to be Democratic. The law says if there's a tie, if the House and Senate can't agree, the tie is broken by the governor of the state. His name was Jeb Bush. She said, it was going to look like a banana republic. So her view was, we're going to take the hit ourselves now. Now, she got a lot of heat for this. She knew it. She was not that comfortable with it. And it's true that 10 years later, she told the Chicago Tribune, maybe the editorial board, maybe we shouldn't have taken the case. Maybe we should have let the process go on. So I asked her about this, and she said, I have regrets, but regrets don't do you any good.
Last question before we go to the audience. At a time in which polarization and partisanship is at an all-time high in this country, you've written a book about an ardent moderate.
I'll say.
Why do you think that the American people should revisit the story of Sandra Day O'Connor at this moment in time? And are there other lessons that you hope people will take from your book?
Well, if there is a lesson from her, and it's the one that she cared about her legacy, Sandra O'Connor was religious. I mean, she didn't go to church a whole lot. She went some to the National Cathedral, but she didn't in Arizona. Her church was the giant sky. She would look out at those stars at night and see God. But she was a spiritual person, but I think her real religion was kind of a civic religion. She had a belief in civic life, in being civil, and in our capacity to get along. And I mentioned earlier that she didn't think of the Supreme Court as the last resort. It was part of this ongoing conversation. And she really believed in that. And she did little things that kind of surprised me. When there was a lot of incivility in Congress in the 90s, along about the time of Bill Clinton's impeachment, she secretly summoned the majority leader, Tom Daschle, and the minority leader, Trent Lott from the Senate, and had them into her chambers and lectured them on civility. They were kind of taken aback by this. I mean, this is slightly not what the separation of powers is all about, but it shows you how urgently she felt about this. And I know that her last public statement was when Congress hung up Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court. Justice O'Connor said, oh, come on, appoint, she's a Republican. Get on with it. Let's get on with it. And that's her view. Let's get on with it. Let's make it work.
Great. Question over here.
Thank you. I appreciate that you've written this book. I didn't as a woman lawyer, but I wanted to ask a question about you as an author. A friend of mine reminded me that you're actually the grandson of Norman Thomas, the great socialist thinker. And I just wondered if he lived a long life. I just wondered if you cared to briefly comment about whether you were close to him, and also whether you would ever write about your family, as I think David Moranis just wrote about his family. Thank you.
I just had lunch with David Moranis, and I said, man, it's tough to write about your family. It is tough. He mentioned to me that he wrote about his father after he died. I love my grandfather, who was a wonderful man. He was not the world's greatest father in the world because he was off saving the world as a socialist candidate. He ran for president 6 times. So for my father, he was not a good father. But as a grandfather, he was a loving figure. And my great disappointment was that I was coming back from school to ask him about socialism and how he could reconcile it with human nature, and he died in 1968. So I never got to ask him the question, but I certainly knew him and I loved him.
Hi. From reading her book, from the one she wrote long ago, and observing her life, one of the things that surprised me in the book was how politically savvy she was from a young age, really, and then also what a social animal she was.
Yeah.
And growing up in such isolation, where did that come from?
Yeah, that's a right good question. She had to get along with people who weren't naturally her friends. Her playmates were these dirty cowboys. When she was born on this ranch, no electricity, no running water. Once a week, Mrs. Day would take a bath, and then all the cowboys would take a bath. I mean, it was really rough, and she had to put up with a lot, and she learned how to get along with people. In fact, the first time I really spent time with her, she had already been diagnosed with dementia. I watched her work a room of 150 people. You'd never know that anything was wrong with her. Some people have the knack. She did. She had a way of looking you in the eye. She's a little scary that way, but also being totally focused on you in the way that really great communicators have. Yeah. She did. She scared her clerks. I mean, it's a funny story. She cared about them being fit. So the women had to go to aerobics class with her in the morning. The men had to stay fit too. One of them was eating an ice cream cone. She came around the corner and he put the ice cream cone in a drawer. So let's see.
Over here.
I'm wondering if she read the book and what she thought of the book.
We gave her the book. This is a sad story for me. She has advanced dementia now. So I sat there with her. I showed her the pictures. She recognizes her own family now, but that's about it.
2 questions. One, she was, I think, the last Supreme Court justice who actually had some political experience.
Yeah.
And there's been this argument that maybe we should go back to appointing justices who understand the politics. So could you comment on that? And secondly, I'd like you to talk about her leaving the court, because I know in reading the book you suggest she thought she may have made a mistake.
Yeah. She was the last justice who actually had to run for office. And they're all appellate court judges now, I guess, except for, she was a Solicitor General. Kagan, I'm sorry, Justice Kagan, who now actually occupies Justice O'Connor's chambers. And when we met with her, I was very affected by that because she saw Justice O'Connor. I'm going to tell you a story that was very revealing to me. We met with Justice Thomas. I had a hard time getting an interview, but I finally got one. And he said, when I came on the court, the Anita Hill hearings had been terrible. He said, I felt hammered. I was feeling hammered. And I was walking back after my first conference alone. And she walked with me. And she said to me, Clarence, those hearings were very damaging. And he said, Justice Thomas said, I didn't know what to say because they were damaging to me personally, but they were damaging to the court and the country, and so I didn't say anything. The next day, she walked with him again, and the next day, and the next day. And she said, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And finally, she said, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And he said, I did. He said, I finally came, and it changed everything. He had been brooding and alone. And he's not ideologically close to her at all, but he said that she was the glue. She was what held this court together. It was cold before she got there. I gather it's a little cold right now, but she really made a difference just with her will. In fact, Justice Sotomayor told us that she would make people go to lunch by just showing up in their office. She'd just sit there until they went to lunch with her.
Over here.
What was her biggest regret as a ruling justice, and what was the ruling she was most proud of?
She said she regretted. She voted, she really did not like Citizens United after she left the court. She thought the court had gone too far to say that spending money on politics was speech under the First Amendment. She had actually voted that way in an earlier case. She regretted that decision. The only time she's explicitly regretted a vote. I know she had some misgivings about Bush v. Gore that I described earlier. Her favorite case was called Strickland. It was about what's effective counsel, very technical and not a huge interest here. But she was a very good technical lawyer. You know, she was amazing. She was the most sociable Supreme Court justice in history. I know that's not saying a lot, but she was. She went out all the time, and she went out, interestingly, she had to balance a couple of things. She had to read 1,000 pages a night, and she really cared about the technical side. She called the shots with her clerks. She was in charge of her chambers. But she also cared about John, because when John came to Washington, he'd been the big deal in Arizona, in Phoenix, the big lawyer. He was head of the Rotary and all that. Not so much in Washington. In fact, it didn't work out at his law firm. And she went out a lot so that he could be the social lion. At dinner, she wouldn't say much. She'd let him talk and crack jokes. He was a great storyteller and danced. He loved to dance. And she liked to dance, but he really liked to dance. And she did it for him, even knowing, she told me this, that it cut back on her time reading all those cases. Fortunately, she was a speed reader. She was somebody, and I guess she had to be this, to have 3 kids and a good marriage and all that, who never had any downtime. The joke was, in the Arizona legislature, with Sandy, there's no Miller time. Her kids said she never sat on the couch and watched TV. She was going all the time.
Excellent. As a former civics teacher, I was really grateful for all of her stuff she did for civics education. Yeah. Could you just talk just a little bit in general about her post-Supreme Court life and how she took on the cause of civics education and all of that?
She sure did. She said, I have 5 years to be relevant. Oh, I was asked about her leaving the court. I want to get back to that, her leaving the court. Well, let me do this now. She left the court because her husband, John, got Alzheimer's. And she tried to take care of him. She would bring John to her chambers. He would fall asleep on the bench there. And it just became too much. One of the symptoms of Alzheimer's can be that you can't sleep. They slept in the same bed. They'd slept in the same bed forever. He couldn't sleep. She couldn't sleep. And so she retired to take care of him. But within 6 months, he could not recognize her. And this happened, it happens with Alzheimer's patients. He formed what they call a mistaken attachment. He had a girlfriend, somebody he held hands with. How did she deal with this? Well, she would go in and hold John's other hand. Now, she was heartbroken by this, but she said, he had been depressed, now he's happy. She typically, in her Western way, made the most of it. But she also traveled relentlessly. She traveled in the cause of civics, of making people believe in civic government. And she started this organization called iCivics, which does, she knew that kids today are not taught civics, and because civics books are boring, and she, even though she couldn't even do email, she starts this company called iCivics, which sends out video games about how a bill passes Congress. Civics, called iCivics, how a bill passes Congress. It's now, these video games reach 6 million kids, a lot, 6 million kids a year. So that is an important legacy for her.
Absolutely. We partner with iCivics at the Library of Congress, so we're very happy to work with them. Good. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And you can have your book signed by Mr. Thomas at 6:30 in the signing lines. Thank you.